Zaboko sat in a cradle of hills, surrounded by thick groves of whispering trees and the faint scent of smoke always clinging to the wind. The people of the village walked with careful feet and cautious tongues, where silence was not just tradition, it was survival. From the moment a girl could walk, she was taught to listen more than she spoke. Mothers would hush their daughters even in play, gently placing fingers to lips and nodding toward the elders who always watched with tight mouths and heavy eyes. In Zaboko, a woman's voice was not a blessing but a warning. It was believed that the voice of a woman could stir things best left sleeping, ancient winds that once carried secrets and summoned spirits, demons and disasters alike. The old story said that long ago when women spoke freely, rivers dried up, trees split from root to crown, and the sun fled the sky for a whole year. From that darkness a rule was born: keep daughters silent. Girls who forgot this were given threads to bind their tongues and herbs to suppress their words. Among the quiet ones, Elika stood out like a bright coal in a bed of ash. She was born under a blood moon, and the midwife whispered that she came out humming. Her mother, a weaver, tried her best to raise Elika in the ways of hush, but the child was stubborn. She spoke before she walked. By 5 she was making up stories. By 7 she was teaching younger children how to shape tales with their hands, eyes, and voices. She didn't fear the woods like the other children. She would walk into the trees and return with songs the birds had taught her. Her voice was clear and musical, her laughter echoing like bells across the village square. When Elika spoke, people listened even if they didn't admit it. Her stories had a strange way of staying in the air, wrapping around ears like perfume, lingering long after she'd gone quiet. This did not go unnoticed. Monero, the head of the council and the self-proclaimed guardian of Zaboko's sacred laws, took particular offense. He was a tall man, his skin weathered like dried bark, with a long staff always at his side and a scowl that could flatten weeds. He believed order was held by silence, that the ancestors had given men the right to speak and lead while women were made to bear, build, and obey. Elika's defiance was, to him, an affront not only to tradition but to the very fabric of their survival. At community gatherings, when elders shared stories or issued new rules, Elika often asked questions. Simple ones at first: why do we not sing during the planting season? Or, who decided the wind was angry when we speak? These questions made the elders shift in their seats and glance at one another. Some laughed nervously. Some frowned. Monero never laughed. One morning, during the moonswap ceremony, Elika stood among the silent crowd as Monero spoke of the importance of obedience. He raised his staff and spoke of how the sky listens, how every word echoes into the spirit world. Elika, standing near the front, said clearly, "Then let the sky hear my joy." Her voice rang out and stilled the gathering. Even the wind seemed to pause. Children gasped. A woman dropped her basket of leaves. Monero turned slowly, his eyes narrowing like a knife being drawn. Elika did not back away. She smiled, her scarlet wrap catching a gust of air and fluttering like flame. He said nothing then, but the mark was set. She had dared to speak during a sacred rite. She had defied the hush. After that day, whispers began. Not from Elika but about her. Mothers pulled their daughters closer when she passed. Some began to claim their children were having nightmares after playing with her. Others accused her of talking to the wind, an old sign, they said, of spirit possession. When goats gave birth too early or rains came late, someone always muttered her name. Still, Elika didn't stop. She sang while she walked. She greeted birds like family and called to trees with words from old songs. Her mother tried to stop her, but Elika simply asked, "If my voice is wrong, why does it feel so right?" No one had an answer that satisfied her. Monero watched from the shadows. He visited the elders one by one, reminding them of the legends, of the destruction the voice of a woman once caused. He spoke of fire that danced from tongues, of winds that carried away children. He reminded them that one girl's boldness could invite ruin for all. The elders, worn from years of upholding laws passed down through fear, began to nod. It was then that Monero began to craft a plan, one that would restore order, erase the defiance, and remind Zaboko why silence had been their salvation. He would make an example of Elika. And this time it wouldn't be with words. But Elika, even then, even surrounded by suspicion and stares, held her head high. She still sang in the mornings. She still told stories to the children who dared to sneak away to hear her. Her voice didn't shrink. If anything, it grew bolder, more certain. And the winds of Zaboko, those ancient, listening winds, began to stir. The day the fire came was heavy with heat, even though the season had not yet turned. The skies over Zaboko swirled in a strange gray, low and watchful, as if the heavens themselves leaned down to listen. The villagers gathered in the square, summoned by Minero's booming voice that called from the center like thunder. Word had spread quickly. Elika had once again spoken during a sacred meeting. Not whispered. Not sung. Spoken, clear and defiant, challenging Minero's decree that women should only speak when spoken to, and only with permission. Minero stood on the stone dais, his staff taller than most children, his robes pressed and black like ash. His voice rolled across the crowd like a wave crashing on a quiet shore. There must be consequence, he declared. Without order there is ruin. Without respect there is madness. His words weren't just for Elika, they were for the mothers who dared to smile at her, the children who still carried her stories in their pockets like pebbles, and the winds that carried her voice into every corner of the village. Elika was brought before them, not by force but by choice. She walked with her head high, wrapped in a deep red shawl that billowed with every step. Her face was unreadable, calm as the still surface of the forest lake. Minero tried to meet her gaze and failed. She didn't look at him. She looked at the people, at the children in the back, clutching their mothers' legs, at the women with their heads down, lips trembling, and at the few old men whose eyes carried regret like a wound. "I have spoken," Elika said loudly, her voice carrying across the silent square. "And I will speak again." The crowd stiffened. A child began to cry but was quickly hushed. Minero raised his hand, and two of his guards brought forth the iron. It was long, thin and glowing at the tip, fresh from the fire pit. Shaped like a serpent's tongue, it hissed as it met the air. The silence cracked with its sizzle. "This is not punishment," Minero lied. "This is protection. For all of us." But no one believed it, not truly. This was no protection. This was power declaring itself through cruelty. The guards held her arms but she did not fight. She stood tall, even as Minero approached with the brand. Her eyes never left the horizon. She did not plead. She did not curse. The only sound that came when the iron touched her skin was a sharp scream, brief, fierce, like lightning tearing through cloth. Her body trembled, but she did not fall. The smell of burning flesh hung thick in the air. A child vomited in the crowd. A woman fainted. And then, silence. Elika stood with her mouth now scarred, the flesh seared in a twisted symbol of obedience. But her eyes, oh her eyes, they still sang. And that silence was not defeat. It was a silence sharper than any scream. It carried a promise. A vow. And it frightened even the wind. Minero stepped back, panting slightly. "Let this mark be a reminder," he said, but his voice lacked its usual fire. There was something about the way she looked at him, without hate, without fear, that unsettled him. That night, the village lights flickered uneasily. Mothers held their children closer. No one sang. The drums that usually beat softly in the distance had gone still. Elika's hut, near the edge of the forest, was dark. When her mother went to find her at dawn, she found nothing but a piece of crimson cloth caught in the branches of a tree, torn and fluttering like a flag of war. Some said she had wandered into the forest, bleeding and broken, seeking the spirits that Minero had warned against. Others whispered she had walked into the lake and let it swallow her. A few believed she had turned into a bird and flown away, carried by the winds she used to greet. Minero declared her gone. "Let the silence return," he told the village. "Let this be the last story told about her." But stories do not die quietly. Children still whispered her name when the winds were strong. They said they saw her shadow in the trees or heard her humming deep in the night. The branding, once meant to silence, became a symbol instead. Not of shame but of resistance. The mark of one who dared. Minero walked with more caution after that. He tightened the rules. He doubled the guards at the forest edge. And though he never admitted it, he flinched every time the wind carried a whisper too close, too soft, too familiar. For Elika was gone from the village but not from its bones. And the fire he used to shame her, now burned his name into the wind. The forest took her in like a long-lost daughter. Elika stumbled through its tangled limbs and mossy roots, her breath ragged, her lips seared and swollen. She had no sense of time, only the rhythm of pain and the pulse of the wound Minero left upon her face. The world behind her, the village of silence and fire, faded with every step into the whispering dark. The trees here were taller than temples, thick with vines and songbirds whose tunes sounded more like language than music. The earth beneath her bare feet was soft but uneven, and the wind that weaved between the trunks didn't howl, it sang. She walked until her knees gave out, and there she collapsed against a fallen tree wrapped in silver moss. Her vision blurred, her strength gone. But even then she did not cry. Only silence remained, thick and unforgiving. When she woke, it was to the scent of herbs and old smoke and the slow hum of a voice, not a song, but a kind of chant that wrapped around her like a blanket. The hut was round, its roof made of woven bark and feathers. Strange symbols carved into the beams pulsed with faint light. Sitting at the edge of the mat beside her was a woman with skin like river stone and eyes pale as dawn mist. She was ancient, so old Elika thought she might be carved from time itself. "You were not meant to die in that village," the old woman said softly, placing a damp cloth on Elika's brow. "The forest called you back." Elika tried to speak, but the pain flared across her mouth like fresh fire. "No words yet," the woman said. "Let the silence teach you first." The woman's name was Nyeri, and the place where Elika now lay was once the sanctuary of the wind singers, an order of women who had, long ago, spoken the language of the wind and woven power into voice. They had vanished from memory, erased by fear and flame. Their ruins were hidden in the deepest part of the forest, wrapped in vines and buried by time. Only Nyeri remained, a keeper of echoes, a steward of what was nearly lost. For days Elika rested. Nyeri fed her broth made from black roots and bitter leaves. She ground salves from herbs that dulled the ache in Elika's face, though the scar would never leave. "It is your brand, yes," Nyeri said one evening, "but not his. Not anymore. Let it carry your truth." And slowly Elika learned. She learned that sound is memory, that silence can scream, that every voice has a root, and hers ran deeper than she knew. Nyeri showed her how to speak with her breath instead of her throat, how to hum with intention, how to let her heartbeat shape her tone. "Your voice," Nyeri said one morning as birds circled the treetops in spirals, "was never just yours. It carries the voices of those before you, your mother and her mother, and all those burned or buried for speaking." Elika would sit for hours among the fallen stone arches of the Windsinger's sanctuary, listening to the wind slide through the cracks, hearing the soft echoes of words no longer spoken. At night, she dreamed of her village, of the little girls told to hush, of the mothers who bit their tongues until they bled. She dreamed of Monero's face not as a man but as a wall of fear and fire. But she did not burn with vengeance. Not yet. Elika's power grew like a slow-moving vine, curling around her ribcage, whispering at the edge of her lips. The wound on her face became a sigil. Her silence transformed from pain into presence. She walked through the forest with eyes that saw beyond the bark and birds. She listened to the world not as it was, but as it remembered itself. "I want to speak," she told Nyeri one morning, her voice cracked but whole. Nyeri only smiled. "Then speak, but speak with knowing. You are not just Elika now. You are the echo of all they tried to silence." And in that moment the wind swirled around them, not cold, not hot, but alive. And Elika closed her eyes, letting it carry her breath forward. Not for vengeance. But something was coming. And her voice would be ready. Years melted into seasons, and the village of Zaboko, where girls once learned silence before they learned to speak, began to hear whispers where there should have been none. It began with the trees. They rustled not in rhythm with the wind, but in patterns as though speaking in a language of sighs and secrets. The elders tried to explain it away. "It is just the rain talking," they muttered. But even on dry nights the trees whispered. And sometimes the whispers sounded like a name. "Mi, na, aro." At first it was only the children who noticed. They would pause mid-play, heads tilted, blinking into the woods. Some would hum odd melodies, lullabies no one had taught them. "Who taught you that song?" their mothers asked. The children would only shrug as if the question was too simple for an answer. The village dismissed it, strange wind, bad dreams. Until the dreams spread. Monero was the first adult to feel it claw at the corners of his sanity. At night, when the fire in his hut dimmed and the air turned still, he would hear it. His own name, not spoken but exhaled as though the world itself had grown lungs. Monero. It came from the roof, the floor, the crack in his wall. He would sit upright in bed, clutching his robe, sweat soaking through despite the cold. He tried to ignore it. He told himself it was guilt, a ghost of memory. But each morning new things awaited him. A pile of ash shaped like lips near his doorstep, children drawing spirals in the dirt with twigs, as if remembering something they'd never lived. And the wind, it had changed. It didn't blow like it used to. It circled, gathered, carried sound with it, not loud, not fierce, but deliberate. A gentle haunting. It began to spread. Women washing clothes by the river would pause, frowning at the trees swaying without breeze. Goats would bleat nervously at nothing. The village dogs stopped barking and began howling, low and mournful. One night, a girl named Temi woke screaming. She said she'd seen a woman with glowing eyes and a scar across her mouth, standing in her dream, smiling and humming. She said my name, the girl sobbed. She said it like it mattered. The elders, disturbed, called for prayers for purification rituals. But each time they burned herbs and chanted their fear away, the wind only grew stronger, mocking, laughing. Monero began to crumble. He forbade children from singing. He punished anyone caught speaking after sunset. But still the wind brought his name. In the markets, mi, na, ro. In the fields, mi, na, ro. Even his own reflection seemed to mouth the word when he looked into the still waters of the basin. He stopped sleeping. He scratched out every mirror in his hut. The people began avoiding him, whispering that he'd been cursed. One evening, as the sky painted itself in blood orange and violet, Monero stood in the village square, trembling. He shouted at the air, fists raised, spittle flying from his lips. Enough. Show yourself, witch. But the air only responded with laughter, not shrill, not cruel, but calm and echoing. That night, the wind changed direction. It swept into every corner of Zaboko, lifting leaves, bending fire, and carrying a soft, rhythmic chant. It was not loud, not terrifying. It was familiar, a lullaby. And at its center, Alika's name, whispered like a prayer. Like a storm waiting in silence. The villagers began to murmur. Some remembered the girl who'd vanished into the forest. Others wept, realizing too late that the voice they had tried to erase had returned stronger than ever. But Monero? He wept not out of regret but fear. For he understood now, the wind did not merely carry Alika's name. It remembered his. The festival of silence arrived as it always had, marked by the rising of the silver moon and the hush that blanketed Zaboko like snowfall. It was the one day each year when no voice was heard, no greetings, no prayers, not even the crying of babes. Silence was worshipped, honored, and feared. On this night, the villagers wore robes of pale cloth and painted their faces in ash, to remind themselves of the vow, "Speak not, lest the spirits listen." They gathered in the square, eyes lowered, hands clasped, breathing together in quiet unity. Incense curled into the sky. The elders led a procession of fire lanterns down the village paths, placing them at the base of the ancestral trees. All was still, all was sacred. But the wind, oh, the wind had other plans. It began as a breeze, gentle and cool, that rustled robes and tugged at hair. No one flinched, the wind was common. But then it grew. It danced. It twisted through the lantern flames and made them bow unnaturally sideways, flickering in rhythms that looked suspiciously like language. The villagers glanced nervously at one another. Still they remained silent. Then came the voice, not shouted, not spoken, but threaded into the wind like silk woven through branches. Alika. The name slipped through every ear, gentle but firm, as if a mother were calling her child home. People stiffened. A few dropped their candles. Someone gasped, "A crime on this night." No one spoke, but everyone heard. The wind swirled again, and this time it came with rhythm. Not words exactly, but a chant. A melody that carried sorrow and strength. One that reminded the women of their daughters, and the men of a wrong they couldn't name but had long allowed. And above all, woven into every note, was that name, Alika. Alika speaks. Flames twisted higher. Lanterns lifted from the ground as if tugged by unseen hands. The trees swayed despite the roots' grip on the earth. The silence, once holy, now felt like the edge of a scream. Monero rose from the front row of elders, his face pale beneath his ceremonial mask. He stepped into the circle of light, raising both hands to calm the growing panic. The crowd turned toward him, some kneeling, others trembling. But before he could gesture again, a new sound shattered the quiet. Birdsong. Not the usual trill of dawn birds or the coo of doves, but words. Human words. A chorus of parrots, starlings, and magpies perched on the rooftops began to speak in harsh, perfect mimicry. She told stories. She sang to the birds. She asked why she should be silent. She was brave. She was marked. She was branded. She was burned. The villagers' eyes widened in horror. And then, Monero did it. He silenced her. He feared her. He hurt her. The birds repeated it again. Louder. In unison. Monero did it. The crowd broke its vow. Murmurs spilled like floodwater. Some pointed. Some turned away. Monero staggered backward, clutching his robes as if they could protect him from the truth now flapping above. A child near the edge of the square looked up, voice trembling as he spoke aloud the forbidden. Why did we let him? It was the first true sentence spoken during a festival of silence in 100 years. And no spirit punished him. Instead, the wind wrapped around the crowd in a warm hush, almost like approval. Monero collapsed to his knees, staring at the lantern flames that now burned blue. Zaboko would never again hold a festival of silence the same way. Not now that silence had become the voice of shame. The wildfire came without warning. It began in the hills beyond Zaboko, a bright orange glare against the night, flames licking skyward as if the heavens had descended to kiss the earth. Panic swept the village like a fever. Men shouted, women gathered their children, and elders fumbled with buckets and prayers. But the fire didn't come like destruction. It came like a procession. The flames moved unnaturally, swiftly, yes, but with purpose. It curled around the outer huts, hissed along the farmlands, and swept down the paths with terrifying beauty. Yet it burned nothing essential. It passed trees without scorching their bark, skipped over gardens, and ignored the homes of the innocent. Then it stopped, right at the village square. And from its center, untouched by flame or ash, Elika walked. She emerged barefoot from the burning horizon, her long skirt swaying around unharmed ankles. The wildfire bowed away from her steps as though the earth itself knew her return was not one of vengeance, but reckoning. She was not the Elika they remembered. No longer a girl who dared to speak. She was a woman carved from silence and song, her presence undeniable. Her eyes shimmered with power like sunlight caught in obsidian, and her mouth, still marked with the brand Monero had seared into her flesh, glowed faintly with embers of something ancient. Gasps scattered through the crowd as she entered the square. People stepped back instinctively, but not out of fear, out of awe. Elika's voice had not yet been heard. Not fully. Not until now. She stopped in front of Monero. He had risen from his seat as if pulled by some force he could neither fight nor name. Sweat pooled at his brow, though the fire had not touched him. His hands trembled. His eyes darted to the people, hoping for support, finding only silence. Elika looked into him. Not at him, into him. As though her eyes sifted through his bones, through the lies he built like temples, through every time he had struck silence into a girl's heart and called it order. She opened her mouth. Her voice, low, steady, and clear, fell into the square like thunderclouds dropping rain on cracked earth. You burned me to quiet me. Monero flinched. He tried to speak, to deny, to summon the old authority that once held the village in line. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, his lips blistered. It started slowly, tiny welts forming around his mouth. Then more. Then his tongue twisted in pain, swelling in his throat as if rejecting the lies it had once spun so easily. He fell to his knees, clawing at his face. No one moved to help him. Not even the other elders. Elika stepped closer. You feared the power of a voice. Not mine, any voice that challenged your fear. Her scar pulsed with a golden-red glow now, echoing the flames that still burned behind her. The fire did not advance. It simply watched. She turned slowly, letting her voice roll over the crowd like sacred water. It didn't roar. It didn't scream. It resonated. You taught our daughters to hold their tongues, to close their eyes, to shrink. You told them silence was strength. But silence was your shield, not ours. Mothers wept openly. Some fathers bowed their heads in shame. Children looked on with wide eyes, watching a truth unfold that no book or elder had ever dared to speak. The wind rose then. Not a howl, not a storm. A chant. Elika, Elika, Elika. It wasn't just the wind anymore. It was the trees whispering. The flames crackling her name. The birds in the sky circling. The earth beneath their feet humming. Monero writhed, trying to rise. His hands clawed toward Elika, begging perhaps, though no words came. His mouth was sealed now, not by flame but by the very silence he had demanded of others. Elika didn't touch him. She simply whispered, your voice ruled through fear. Mine rises through fire. She turned from him, facing the people of Zaboko. And with her voice, soft, sure and seared with truth, she commanded not submission but awakening. The fire behind her dimmed, then extinguished entirely, leaving only smoke curling into stars. Elika did not need to stay. She had returned not to reign but to release. As she walked away from the square, every step left behind the echo of her voice, and the lesson that no fire, no brand, and no man could silence a voice born of truth. And the wind? It kept chanting. Elika, Elika, Elika. The village of Zaboko had never been quieter. In the days following Elika's return, the wind no longer whispered lullabies, it howled. Not with rage but with memory. It wound through the trees, swept under the doors and rattled windows with voices that refused to be forgotten. Monero's name, like ash on the tongue, drifted in and out of conversations the villagers dared not have allowed. But everyone heard it. In every breeze that rustled the leaves. In every bird that sang in discord. In every child who woke crying from dreams they didn't understand. And so the elders, faces heavy with shame and dread, gathered once more in the council hut, a place that now felt brittle beneath the weight of guilt. Their ceremonial staffs, once a symbol of command, trembled in their hands. They had spent lifetimes guarding silence. Now silence turned against them. It was Elder Mbato, the oldest among them, who spoke what the others would not. "We must ask her," he said, "to end this." Another elder, draped in faded ochre robes, muttered, "If we ask, we admit it. If we admit it, we are already condemned," Mbato replied. "This wind is no longer the wind. It is justice with breath." So they sent for her. Elika came not in fury but in stillness. She stood in the center of the village square, cloaked in the same simple wrap she had worn the night she walked through flame. She did not demand. She waited. The wind moved around her like an old friend, one that knew every secret. The elders approached in silence, bowing their heads, not as rulers but as wrongdoers. They stood before her like stones against a rising tide. "Speak," Elika said, her voice as calm as smoke. Mbato stepped forward, the only one who dared meet her eyes. "The winds torment our people," he said. "The nights are sleepless. The birds repeat what we have not confessed. The trees shake. The crops twist. The voices echo. They will not stop. Because truth cannot be buried," Elika replied. "You cannot silence that which the earth has already heard." Mbato dropped his head. "What do you ask of us?" She took a long breath. "I ask for truth." The elders exchanged glances. Monero, still bruised in pride and spirit, clenched his jaw. "In the square," Elika continued, "where your tongues once condemned, the truth must be spoken aloud. Only then will the winds sleep." Monero stepped forward. "You ask us to grovel." "No," she said, "I ask you to speak." "I owe you nothing," Monero hissed. "You brought this upon us with your stubbornness, your rebellion, your unnatural voice." The wind answered for her. It roared through the square so violently that the torches extinguished instantly. The elders staggered. The thatch roofs trembled. The flame pit spat sparks skyward. Monero turned to flee. But the wind would not let him. He ran down the narrow path that led out of the square, his robes flapping like dying wings, but his feet sank into the earth. Dust whipped around him, stones pelted his back, and the gale formed a wall before him. He screamed, an animal sound, and fell to his knees. The people of Zaboko began to gather, drawn by the storm. From huts and hills they came. Children clung to mothers. Fathers stood still as pillars. The entire village circled the square in breathless silence. Elika stood at the center, untouched by wind or dust. She raised her arm. The wind stilled, but only around the villagers. Monero remained trapped in a cyclone of swirling leaves and voices that spun like a wheel of judgment. "Elika," Mbato said gently, "what must he say?" "What he did," she answered, "and why." Monero looked up at her, his face streaked with dirt, his eyes wild. "They will kill me." "No," she said. "They will know you." The wind pressed harder, bending his shoulders, pulling at his robes like hands tearing secrets from flesh. He collapsed. The square was so quiet that even the air waited. "I branded her," Monero said, his voice cracked. I burned the mouth of a girl because I was afraid." Gasps rippled through the crowd. He continued, choking on words that had clung to his ribs for too long. "I feared what she could awaken in others. I feared that if girls spoke they would question. If they questioned they would disobey. If they disobeyed," he looked up, tears mixing with ash, "then they would no longer need me." Elika didn't speak. The wind did. It softened now, a breeze that brushed past cheeks and whispered forgiveness for those who listened. Children stepped forward, drawn by the calm. "I said she was cursed," Monero went on. "I told you all her voice would summon spirits. But it wasn't spirits I feared, it was truth." His voice cracked into a whisper. "I was a coward clothed in tradition." Mbato stepped forward, tears streaking his face. "We all were." One by one, the other elders removed their ceremonial beads and laid them at Elika's feet. The fire from her scar flickered softly, then dimmed. She stepped toward Monero. He trembled, expecting rage. A strike. A scream. She knelt instead. And placed her hand, gentle, firm, on his chest. "You do not deserve mercy," she said. "But this village deserves healing." He sobbed, curling into himself. The villagers watched, not as judges but as witnesses. "Elika," Mbato said, stepping closer. "Will the wind sleep?" She looked up at the sky. The stars were still. "It will rest," she said. "But only if you do not forget." The wind sighed, a low exhale through the leaves. That night, the elders sat in the center of the square and repeated their truths. All of them. Not just what they had done, but what they had let happen. The village listened. Some wept. Some turned away. Some knelt with their children and whispered promises into small ears. The wind carried it all. Not to punish. To preserve. By dawn, Monero's voice was gone. Not from magic, not from wind, but from choice. He never spoke again. He sat outside the square each morning, carving stories into wood for children, silent but never mute again. Elika did not stay in Zaboko. She left with the wind, vanishing into the trees like a spirit born of flame and truth. But her voice remained. In lullabies. In the whistle of air through narrow alleys. In the song of birds that no longer feared. In every girl who learned to speak her name, and her truth, aloud. Zaboko never returned to silence. Because silence had been the lie. And now truth had learned to sing. Monero's name, once spoken with authority and fear, became a curse whispered only in shadows. The villagers learned quickly that to utter it aloud was to invite a burning sensation deep in the chest and a choking smoke curling up from the ground beneath their feet. Mothers hushed their children when the name surfaced, while the elders averted their eyes, unwilling to speak the word that had become a flame no one could contain. It began subtly at first. One morning, as dawn painted the sky with orange and gold, a thin wisp of smoke curled from the roof of Monero's home at the edge of Zaboko. The villagers watched from a distance as the smoke thickened into choking black clouds. They hurried away, for no one dared approach the house once the whispers of his name floated through the air. Inside the burning walls, Monero stood alone, his face streaked with soot and regret. No one came to save him. Not the neighbors, not the elders, not even the children who once listened to his harsh commands. The fire seemed not born of wood or flame but of something far older and angrier, the collective judgment of a village wronged. Outside, the animals of Zaboko fled from the area. Chickens clucked nervously and scattered, goats bolted through the brush, and even the stoic village dogs whimpered and tucked their tails between their legs. The earth beneath Monero's home felt hotter than any other spot, as if the soil itself sought to expel his presence. As the flames devoured what remained of Monero's house, the wind carried a faint echo of his name, searing, sharp, and unforgiving. In stark contrast, Elika moved freely through Zaboko, embraced now not as an outcast but as the voice of renewal. She walked through the fields, her song rising clear and pure into the sunlit air. Birds gathered around her, perching on her outstretched arms as if the melodies she sang were a promise of life itself. Where her footsteps fell, wildflowers bloomed in vivid colors, and crops stretched upward as if trying to reach her voice. During healing ceremonies, Elika's voice was the heart of the rituals. The villagers gathered around her, aching wounds pressed gently to her lips as she whispered ancient chants taught by Nyeri. Her breath seemed to weave threads of warmth and comfort, knitting skin and sinew with invisible hands. She sang to the sick and the old, and they smiled, feeling strength returning like the soft dawn after a long night. The cool breeze that always accompanied her presence was not just a breeze, it was a balm. When someone called her name, the air shifted, settling over the skin like a soothing touch, cool and refreshing as the shade beneath a mango tree. Her name became a song of hope, a word that carried the power to heal, to protect, and to awaken. But when Monero's name slipped past trembling lips, the heat rose. Not a welcoming warmth, but a fiery burn that tightened throats and reddened faces. The earth beneath their feet seemed to simmer, the air thickening like smoke in a closed hut. Fathers stopped telling their children stories of Monero, for fear the very mention would ignite old wounds still raw and unhealed. Even the elders who once stood beside him in judgment, treated his name as a taboo, a spark too dangerous to kindle. Elika's voice became the antithesis to that fire. She gathered the village for a midsummer ritual, singing a song passed down through the ruins of the Windsingers. Her voice wove through the crowd like a gentle river, carrying away fear and planting seeds of courage. Her words healed the soil and coaxed the rain from distant clouds. They soothed the restless winds and lulled the restless hearts of the villagers. And everywhere she went, the breeze seemed to follow, cooling the fevered brow of a child, softening the hardened hands of the farmers, calming the flapping of restless birds. One evening, as the village gathered beneath a sky dusted with stars, a child, barefoot and wide-eyed, whispered Alika's name into the night. The wind shifted instantly, a gentle caress that brushed through the leaves and carried the promise of dawn. In that moment the villagers knew the truth. The power that Monero sought to silence, the voice that had been branded and burned, was not just a sound. It was life itself. And it could not be caged. The fire that Monero ignited with fear consumed his legacy, leaving behind only ash and silence. But Alika's voice? It was the wind that would carry the village forward, singing, healing, and growing strong. After the fire that consumed Monero's house and the burning of his name in the hearts of the villagers, a profound silence fell over Zaboko, but it was no longer the fearful, oppressive hush that once stifled the girls and women. Instead, it was a reverent pause, a breath held in anticipation of something new. Alika, the woman who had once been branded and cast out, now stood as a beacon of transformation. The air around her hummed with quiet power as she gathered the village's daughters beneath the open sky, beneath the vast expanse where the wind danced freely with the grasses. It began simply, Alika teaching the young girls to speak aloud without fear. Her voice was steady, her eyes bright with determination. She taught them the songs that had been forgotten, the stories that had been whispered only in secret, and the power of their own words. She showed them how to write, carving letters into soft clay tablets and sketching symbols in the dirt with sticks. The act of writing was magical, each stroke a reclamation of identity, a defiance against the silence imposed by generations before. The girls learned quickly, their voices growing stronger each day, lifting like birds taking flight. Their laughter, once hidden behind closed doors, spilled into the streets, weaving a new melody into the fabric of village life. But Alika knew that voice alone was not enough. There had to be a place to honor these voices, a sanctuary where words could live beyond the moment they were spoken. So, together with the villagers, she began building what would come to be known as the Temple of Voices. It was unlike any temple Zaboko had ever seen. No stone walls rose to the sky, no pillars stood carved with ancient glyphs. Instead, it was a temple made of wind and voice, a living, breathing space formed by the collective breaths and sounds of the people. Under the tallest tree in the village, where the wind always seemed to whisper, Alika guided the children and elders alike in a ritual of song and chant. The air trembled with their voices, weaving invisible threads that stretched from leaf to leaf, from branch to branch, creating a sanctuary made not of wood or stone, but of sound itself. The temple was a place to gather, to sing, to speak, to share stories and truths. It was a symbol of freedom, of the power that had been reborn in their voices. But Alika did more than teach and build. She created a book. This book was no ordinary collection of words. Bound in soft leather and filled with pages of delicate parchment, it was a repository for every voice that had once been silenced. Each girl and woman who learned to speak or write was invited to contribute. They wrote down their stories, their songs, their fears, and their dreams. The book grew heavy with the weight of these voices, a living chronicle of the village's rebirth. Alika guarded it carefully, knowing its power. For it was said among the elders and the wind singers that to read aloud from the Book of Voices was to summon the winds of truth. These winds carried the pure essence of words, unfiltered, unafraid, and unwavering. When called forth, the winds of truth would sweep through the village, blowing away lies and fears, bringing clarity and healing. It was a power unlike any other, and one Alika wielded with wisdom. On the first full moon after the temple was complete, Alika stood before the gathered crowd, the Book of Voices open in her hands. Her voice rang clear as she began to chant, calling forth the ancient words taught to her by Nyeri. The wind stirred, rising from the earth and twirling through the branches overhead. A hush fell over the village as the whispers of the wind grew into a chorus, carrying voices from the book, the voices of ancestors, daughters, mothers, and sisters. The air shimmered with the presence of truth. As the wind swept through Zaboko, it cleansed the fears that had once bound the village. Old wounds softened, and the hearts of the people opened wider than they had in generations. Children who had never spoken before whispered softly to their mothers. Women who had hidden their thoughts now shared their hopes aloud. Men, once rigid in their silence, listened and learned to hear. The Book of Voices became the heart of the village, a sacred object passed from hand to hand, its pages alive with the echoes of all who dared to speak. Alika's dream was fulfilled, not by the power of fire or fear, but by the strength of words carried on the wind. And in the nights that followed, when the village lay quiet beneath the stars, the soft murmur of voices could be heard rising from the temple, a reminder that every voice, once silenced, had found its home. Alika's hair had turned silver, catching the sunlight like threads of dawn woven into a tapestry of years. Her hands, once calloused from the forests and the writing of sacred words, now trembled ever so slightly. But her voice remained as vibrant and clear as the day she first sang to the birds in the village square. The years had been kind to her spirit, harsh only in the lessons she bore with quiet grace. Through seasons of hardship and renewal, Elika had become more than a woman. She had become a living legend, a symbol woven deeply into the heart of Zaboko. Her songs were no longer just melodies, they were the breath of the village itself, rising and falling like the winds that danced through the trees. On the morning of her last day, the sun rose slow and golden, bathing the world in a soft light that seemed to hush the very earth. Elika felt the weight of time gently urging her forward, a call from the sky that no mortal could deny. She dressed in a simple cloak embroidered with symbols of the wind and voice, the marks of her sacred mission. With steady steps, she made her way to the edge of the village, where the land dipped sharply into the vastness below. The tallest cliff overlooked the valley, a place where the sky seemed close enough to touch and the wind sang its wildest songs. Villagers gathered silently behind her, a river of faces etched with awe and sorrow. Children clung to their mothers, elders held their breath, and even the animals of the forest seemed to pause, sensing the significance of the moment. Elika faced the horizon, her eyes reflecting the endless sky above. Then she lifted her voice, soft at first, like a whisper carried by the breeze. Her song was ancient, filled with the wisdom of her ancestors and the power of every voice she had helped reclaim. It rose steadily, weaving through the branches, soaring over the hills and spilling into the open air. The wind responded, swirling around her in a dance as old as time. Her song told stories of silence shattered, of fear transformed into courage, of voices rising to meet the dawn. As her melody grew, the air shimmered with unseen magic. The wind wrapped around Elika, lifting her gently as if the very sky was embracing her. Her feet left the earth, and her body began to ascend slowly, carried upward by the invisible currents she had summoned with her voice. The crowd watched, spellbound, as she rose higher and higher, becoming one with the clouds. Her cloak fluttered like a banner of light, and her hair streamed behind her like silver flames. Then, as she reached the peak of the sky, her form began to dissolve, first into glimmers of light, then into nothingness, leaving behind only the lingering echo of her song. The wind settled, carrying the last notes of her lullaby through the valley, weaving it into the fabric of Zaboko. From that day forward, whenever the wind swept through the village, it hummed Elika's song, a soothing melody that wrapped the people in comfort and strength. And there was another magic still. Every time Monero's name was spoken, a spark would ignite in the air, a tiny flicker of fire that reminded the villagers of the price of silence and the power of truth. It was a spark of warning and a beacon of hope, a sign that words carry weight beyond the moment they are uttered. Elika had become the wind, her song forever etched in the sky. Her legacy lived on, not in stone or scrolls, but in every breath the village took, in every voice that dared to speak freely, and in the endless dance of the wind carrying her melody across the world.